Welcome to the lecture series on vitamins and nutrition. Today we are going to continue from the previous session on this important water soluble vitamin niacin. Now we are going to look at different aspects of vitamin niacin. In the previous session I dealt on the introduction of niacin, the historic background behind the discovery of niacin, and the very important key association between niacin and pellagra. So, we also looked at the symptoms of pellagra. We are going to see further today, and we also looked at different people who had tremendously contributed in the discovery and in the role of niacin in various metabolic functions, and we saw all those key people who were very instrumental in establishing relationship of niacin in the diseases concerned with deficiency of water soluble vitamin. Now, if you look at niacin, in the previous session we saw there are two forms of niacin. You have the nicotinic acid form and the nicotinamide form. Both are functionally active and equally good, but among them nicotinamide is a preferred choice because some of the side effects associated with nicotinic acid administration can be overcome by the use of nicotinamide. Now, if you look at niacin, we saw in the previous session how niacin is the key component for NAD and NADP. So, NAD is nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide and NADP is a phosphated version of NAD. Now, we also saw the oxidized form and the reduced form NAD plus and NADPH. So, you see there in the oxidized form and in the reduced form different versions of how nicotinamide could perform in a biochemical way. Now, we also saw the different sources of niacin and different rich sources of niacin. In fact, thiamine and niacin almost share the same kind of sources. So, if you could take a hold on those nutritional choices for providing thiamine, the same choices hold good even for niacin. Now, we saw how NAD being a key cofactor for various enzymes involved in the glycolytic pathway. We saw enzymes like glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate dehydrogenase, lactate dehydrogenase need NAD, and how NAD catalyzed lactate dehydrogenase reactions from lactic acid to pyruvic acid or lactate to pyruvate, how these reactions are quite dependent on NAD. We also saw the overall participation of NAD in various metabolic enzymes in the various important functional role that they play in the biochemical pathway. Say for example, lactate dehydrogenase, then beta hydroxyacyl dehydrogenase. Especially with regard to this, we also saw how they play a very essential role in the fatty acid metabolism and even in the pentose phosphate pathways. And as a continuation from there, we are going to kickstart, and we saw in the previous session a very important role, a practical role is its contribution in the lipid metabolism. So, in the lipid metabolism, you look at some of the key cholesterol components or lipid components. So, total cholesterol, normally whenever you do a lipid panel test, so if you go to a physician and when you have symptoms of coronary artery diseases, they are very particular in looking at what would be the lipid profile of the patient concerned. So, they do this panel test. So, they want to check the total amount of cholesterol, triglycerides, HDL and LDL. In general, we always consider the level of HDL should be high, whereas the levels of triglyceride and LDL should be low within the acceptable range. Suppose if you have to really look at a diet, you want to have a control on triglyceride and LDL level, and you are looking for a diet where you would want to keep it at bay. You do not want to get into dyslipidemia related conditions, then niacin would be the drug of choice. So, in this category, niacin now gets promoted from being a mere vitamin to a role of being a drug. So, that way even now niacin at an higher doses are prescribed in the treatment of cholesterol diseases or in the treatment of lipid diseases. So, you see there elevated levels of triglyceride, LDL and a decreased level of HDL has a direct impact on vascular related conditions, atherosclerosis, that can give rise to stroke, that can give rise to heart problem. So, if you are going to keep triglyceride and LDL in check and also persistent elevated level of HDL, that is going to be good for your heart. Okay. So, we saw in the previous session how this particular hormone, basically the hormone lipase, which is having an impact on adipose releasing fatty acid, and the liberated fatty acid now goes over there and gets stored in the liver, and liver would actively contribute in the production of triglycerides, which eventually would be transported across as VLDL and LDL, and this LDL is supposed to be the thread responsible for atherosclerotic plaques. Okay, and that is the reason behind the narrowing of coronary artery vessels. Now, you look at this, how niacin basically inhibits this hormone and thereby has a check on free fatty acid release, and thereby directly has an impact on triglyceride level, bringing down the level of triglyceride, and eventually once this is set in motion, the final LDL resulting out of this entire sequence of events also becomes low. And for some unknown reason, the HDL level, probably through this control mechanism, or probably you have a kind of a negative feedback. So, when there is a decrease in the level of LDL, there is a proportionately increased level of HDL. So, this pathway is not completely elucidated, but it is known as a consequence of reducing the LDL values, the HDL values also get elevated. So, this is how the niacin contributes in a healthy maintenance of lipid diet. Okay, so, you find over there how basically you look at different aspects of how you can have a check on lipid profile for a healthy metabolism and physiology. Now, we are also going to look into what are the daily requirements. So, you have like to treat deficiency conditions. Okay, the daily requirement would be on a healthy note like 20 mg per day, and you could get a very well supplementation from the healthy diet, a balanced diet if a person is going to follow. And at times of lactation, as you know, the mother has to take more for the growing fetus, even as she would feed on the growing infant. So, there would be an additional load of niacin, because it would also be promoted, it would be demanding for the body for the extra load of work and the secretion of for the lactation related biochemical changes happening in the mother's body. So, there is obviously increased need of niacin. But suppose if you are going to look at people who have been there on a deficit of niacin for a very long period of time and who have already into that phase of pellagra, okay, the deficiency condition associated with niacin, they need to take intake of at least 150 mg to 500 mg to restore back the niacin related problems. And if you know, if a person is already on a balanced diet, you do not have that issue. We are talking about people who are in need of supplementing the loss of niacin deficiency over a period of time, whereas the normal daily requirement would be only 20 mg per day. So, for pellagra it can go up to 150 mg to 500 mg, and especially if you are going to look at niacin being supplemented as a drug to treat lipid dyslipidemia, irregular lipid levels, elevated lipid levels, especially triglyceride level and LDL level, and a proportionate decrease in HDL, then we need to go for niacin being taken as a drug. So, the dosage you see goes up to 1000 milligrams, probably a gram on to 2 grams per day. And the safe limit for niacin, although it is a water soluble vitamin, unlike fat soluble vitamin, which has to be very carefully regulated because they can go and get deposited in the liver and can give rise to lots of complications associated with hypervitaminosis, but that is not the case for many of the water soluble vitamins. But some of the water soluble vitamins, let us say for niacin, needs to be under check. So, you have a ceiling dose of 8000 milligrams and per day, and we have to always tailor the dosage being given up to this limit of 8000 milligrams per day. See, one interesting side effect associated with niacin supplementation would be flushing. Okay, this might sound little bizarre, but for some reason, because of its role in the vasculature connected with lipid profile, this is an unavoidable side effect. Okay, so you see there, it is a kind of a gesture, as you seen, a person flushing. So, this is a symptom, and what you can do for people, especially supplementing with niacin, you want to minimize this effect. So, they normally recommend taking the medicine at bedtime, so that during the daytime you need not have this kind of a flushing symptom seen. And moreover, the nicotinamide version of niacin has relatively less of this particular side effect. Now, if you look at what would be the classical symptom of pellagra, so you see there, the dry scaly skin would be the problem of pellagra. And if you could look back the picture of the patients who have been documented with pellagra, I want you to be aware of the corresponding skin symptoms associated with pellagra. Although pellagra is supposed to be a condition which has been known well and documented. So, you see this picture. So, this is that kind of a scaly appearance noted in patients who suffer from niacin deficiency for a very long period of time. So, the classical symptom is peeling of skin with redness, okay, and especially if the skin is exposed to sun, there would be a periodic peeling kind of symptom. See, we should not mistake this with psoriasis, which is an autoimmune disease, and in case with psoriasis, supplementing with dietary changes may not fully help, except for if the person is going to have an increased level of psoriasis symptom associated with allergy, but pellagra related symptoms are quite different. So, you see over there, it is a constant deprivation or deficiency of niacin for a quite long period of time. So, we saw how niacin is so important in the metabolic pathway and in the energy metabolism concerned with the mitochondria. So, their deficiency would directly have an impact on proliferating cells, including epidermal cells, including the mucosal cells, and that is quite common to have this particular side effect. So, you look over here, this particular symptom of pellagra is represented as dermatitis, okay, and also very interesting thing to note. So, there would be a pattern of increased pigmentation around the skin, and this one is basically called as Castle's necklace. So, this is a typical symptom concerned with pellagra, and you would also notice people who suffer from niacin deficiency have frequent nauseating vomiting symptoms. There would be GI upsets, and because NAD is such an essential energy providing molecule in many of the metabolic pathways concerned with energy metabolism. So, brain which needs a lot of energy for its functioning, when it is being deprived, is represented as inability to concentrate accompanied by headache. So, this is one of the key symptoms concerned with niacin deficiency. And very interesting enough, historically it is well proven, people who are on a corn diet, okay, especially you see corn as their main meal, and in corn you do have niacin, but the niacin is seen in a kind of a conjugated form. So, historically when people did a survey and study of those areas where the staple diet has been corn, even the method by which the food processing is done has contributed in a large way in understanding how such vitamins like niacin needs to be processed from food. So, they found some of the ancient people who lived in the regions of South America had a habit of treating corn with lime, lime soaked corn, and processing similar to that. See, for example, this is what they call it, like hominy, which is nixtamalized corn kernels, they say. So, what they do is especially in Mexico and in the South America, where you have people traditionally when they make tortilla from the corn meal, they prepare the corn meal mixed with lime. So, this kind of process, treating corn and mixing with lime and then preparing the flour, would actually disrupt the basically the conjugated version of niacin. So, niacin is released. So, whenever they had developed this technique of nixtamalized version of treating the corn kernel, those people, although they were on a staple diet of corn meal, did not suffer from dietary deficiency of niacin. This had really gone to a level of understanding food processing to retain essential vitamins like niacin. So, whereas that group of people, especially northern Italy and other places where people were not aware of or experimented with variety of methods, suffered from deficiency diseases of niacin. So, that way it has contributed in a large way how you process food. Now, if you look closely, you also see some of the biosynthetic pathway can give rise to niacin deficiency. See, if you look at it, it's quite interesting. One of the hydrophobic amino acids, tryptophan, gets converted into kynurenine, and then this particular enzyme kynurenase converts or synthesizes niacin. Suppose if a person is being deprived of tryptophan, that can actually give rise to niacin deficiency. In fact, that is the case with this interesting disease, what we call it like Hartnup disease. So, in this disease you find there is a problem in the way by which essential amino acids like tryptophan getting into the system. So, these people have a problem, a genetically inherited problem. It is a genetic disease. There is a mutation in the gene. It is a recessive disorder where the essential amino acids like especially tryptophan, although they take it from a dietary source, it fails to go inside systemic circulation crossing the gastrointestinal tract. So, because the co-transporter system which helps in the transport of tryptophan amino acids into across the gastrointestinal tract from the small intestines for absorption is hampered. So, no tryptophan goes across. Not only that, it is more interesting to note the same transporter kind of mechanism associated with the same gene problem can also be seen in the kidneys, where kidneys have a provision to reabsorb amino acids like tryptophan. So, you see none of the tryptophan from the dietary source goes inside, and at the same time whatever tryptophan that is already there in circulation